All right, good morning all. My name is Camille. I've been here for about 2 years now and like to take you through managing mason bees. This presentation is mainly going to be for the active season. Later on, probably in early to mid-October, I'll be doing a second presentation on the harvesting of mason bees. So this is just your basics to get going for now. So before we get started into mason bees, I just want to go over a couple of bees that you're going to see in your backyard, just kind of give you an idea of what you're looking at here. Your most common bee that is not native is going to be your European honeybee. Everybody knows Apis mellifera. They aren't necessarily pushing your mason bees out of your garden. They are active pollinators that are going to help with your biodiversity. They're good to have around. As far as native social bees, there are a few of them out there, bumblebees included. There are many species of bumblebees in Oregon, and it's pretty awesome to track them all down and identify them, but not what we're doing today. So if you're interested in your native bees, check out the website below. And there's a pretty awesome booklet that OSU features right here. So there are over 500 species and counting in Oregon of native solitary bees. You're going to be very commonly seeing sweat bees, metallic sweat bees, mining bees, carpenter bees, longhorn bees, and cuckoo bees. The most commonly domesticated bees are leafcutter bees, which occur in summer, and your early mason bees, which we're going to be discussing today. Just a visual, I know it doesn't always work just spitting out all the names here. On the left, we have your European honeybee, Apis mellifera. There is one species of honeybee that we're focused on here, but many different hybrids. So you've got your Italians, your Caucasians, your Carniolans, and so on. As far as native bees, up here, the green bee here is a metallic sweat bee. Directly below, we have a non-metallic sweat bee. There are many species of both of these, so you'll see them around the garden. They're pretty awesome just to kind of follow around. We have your social bumblebee up here in the top right. They are absolutely covered in pollen and hilarious to watch around, but they nest in the ground, so that makes domesticating them rather difficult. On the daffodil down here, this is a male blue orchard mason bee, and this is what the presentation is going to be about. He is a cavity nester, so he's easy to domesticate, and we can kind of manage him in the gardens. Hoverflies are kind of an interesting little insect here. They're actually pretty good pollinators, and they're great to have around the garden. They're not going to be bothering you in any way, and they look a lot like a bee, but if you focus on the wings here, they have a single set of wings instead of the double set of wings that your bees have. The eyes are a little bit different, and they have toes on their feet. So take a look around your garden for the hoverflies. They're kind of interesting. So of mason bee, there are 3 major species that are domesticated. We'll be focusing on the blue orchard mason bee. They nest in cavities, typically in wood or plant stems. So if a blackberry's been broken off, there's a little hollow in the blackberry stem, and that would provide a really nice home for a mason bee. You also have your domesticated tubes here. You have your wood blocks. It's pretty easy to provide a good nesting area for these bees. They are called mason bees because of their nesting behavior. They'll take moist clay soil and they'll actually pack that into their tubes. So they're little masons. They have a pretty short active lifespan. You'll only see them out for a couple of weeks in spring. Most of their life is spent in the cocoon. So like I said, the blue orchard mason bee is a very early bee. It makes it more useful than the European honeybee for such early fruiting trees as peach, plum, and pear. You're going to see them out as early as late February, but if you're releasing your own cocoons, it's usually safer to do so in mid-March. Once we see temperatures rising, there's a little bit of a break in the rain. These smaller cocoons are males and they will hatch first, followed several days later by the larger cocoons that are females. Because they're solitary bees, all females are fertile, so they are all actively their own queen, versus when you're talking about honeybees, you have one queen and then a massive colony. The mason bees will continue egg laying immediately after hatching. It takes probably 2 days for them to be able to start laying eggs, and then they'll continue all the way through mid to late May. You won't actually take your mason bee block out until early April. So basic management practices to include, you want to be sure you're placing your mason bee house in the proper area. Morning sun is incredibly important. That's how your bees are going to know it's time to wake up, it's time to go harvest. They're going to get a lot more done if they're waking up early. Early bird gets the worm, so to speak. Proper materials are very important. It's pretty common that you'll see mason bee houses that are less than functional. So it's important to know which mason bee house is going to be functional for years, which mason bee house is more decorative. So I've got 2 photos in this slide here. One with the bee house, Be Our Guest, and another with several pieces of wood that had holes drilled in them. You can use this for a season, the drilled holes, but the problem is you can't actually harvest the mason bee cocoons from those drilled holes. So if you're looking at a mason bee tube, the mason bees are going to be laid all in a line down this tube. And let's say you have a healthy mason bee way back here, followed by several mason bees up here that have pollen mites and other pests and fungal diseases. The healthy bee is going to be infected by all of those things on its way out. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important to harvest your cocoons and make sure you have proper nesting materials that make it easy to do this. Harvesting and cleaning, went over harvesting briefly, and we're going to be doing that again in the following class in October. Cleaning is really important to get rid of your pests, to get rid of your fungal diseases, chalk brood namely, and winter protection. Once you have your mason bee cocoons free of your nesting materials, you'll actually store them in your refrigerator over winter until you can release them at the proper time in spring. So just a brief overview here of your seasonal tasks. Mid-February, it's a good idea to put out your house and your nesting materials. I wouldn't necessarily say put your cocoons out in mid-February, but putting your house and your materials out around this time is going to encourage wild populations to begin nesting. So you might get a little bit ahead of the curve here. In mid-March, coming up real fast here, you might be able to get away with releasing the cocoons, some of the cocoons today, but it's probably a good idea to wait until the rains from this next week. While mason bees can forage in rainy conditions, it's a good idea when they very first hatch that you have at least 3 days of really nice weather. Nice weather for mason bees being daytime temperatures. Nighttime temperatures don't matter so much, but daytime temperatures of 55 degrees and above. And you want no or minimal rain and wind. So that gives them a really excellent start. They can go out, they can forage, they can get a little bit of a backup. Early June, this is getting into later season. Your mason bees are done laying their eggs at this point. You should see many clay cappings on the ends of your tubes here. You'll pull your mason bee nesting tubes, be it a block or a tube, put them in a brown paper bag, works just fine. It just needs to be ventilated. And you're going to store these protected from rodents and parasites in moderate temperatures. A garage will do nicely. A shed works as well. Just make sure that you have normal outside temperatures. You don't want it too cold. You don't want it too hot. And what this is doing is when you're pulling them in early June is you're protecting them from parasites and you're allowing the mason bees to actually finish their production. They are still in the larval stage at this point. and you want them to be fully full adults in their cocoons before you harvest, which would be happening in October. You're going to remove the cocoons from your tubes and your nesting blocks in October, harvest them, clean them with a little bit of a bleach solution and some water, and then refrigerate them with proper parameters for winter protection. All right, so I'll take you through just a couple of your supplies. Your mason bee house is going to need to have proper positioning, like I said before. You want it to be protected from moisture. You don't want a bunch of rainwater collecting in your mason bee house. So if you've got your mason bee house on a stake on the side of your house or something, tilt it forward just a tiny bit so that when the rain comes through, if you've got some sideways rain or something, it falls down out the front of the mason bee house rather than collecting in the bottom. Morning sun is absolutely essential. The bees rise with the sun. They use the sun, kind of like honeybees, to orient themselves and find their nectar sources. Eye level is a great height to place your mason bee houses. This lifts the houses high enough to discourage pests. If the pests really want the mason bee cocoons, there's not much you can really do about it, but you're going to discourage pests like ants and skunks from getting into your mason bee house by elevating it to eye level. Something that may be kind of difficult in this area, there are so many bird lovers around here. Bird feeders can be a threat to your mason bee houses. So make sure if you have a bird feeder in the front yard, try and put your mason bee house in the backyard to discourage the birds from predating on your cocoons and your adult bees. It is important to note that mason bees have a pretty short flying distance. They want to stick within about 100 yards of where they were born. So you need to be near flowering plants. Make sure your plants are actively flowering when you release your cocoons. So if you've got fruit trees, that's wonderful. If you've got native flowers all around, that's awesome. Anything that's flowering and has an ample amount of pollen and nectar will work. Wet clay mud is abundant in Oregon, luckily, but we need to make sure that the clay soil stays muddy for the mason bees, as this is their most important nesting material. If they can't find wet clay mud in the vicinity of their nest, they will move, and you'll find that you won't have any mason bees nesting in your house. When you are filling your mason bee house, make sure to fill it completely with nesting material or something else to kind of fill it up. What I've got in here is I've just got some mason bee tubes. This house is not nearly full enough, so I'd put something in here just as kind of a filler, and this will prevent all sorts of pests and things from hanging out in there as well. So I've got a couple of examples here of mason bee housing. You can get really fancy with it. You can have something pretty simple as well. We have small wooden houses, large wooden houses, something as simple as a PVC pipe, as long as it's about 6 inches long and it'll hold an ample amount of mason bee tubes. That works just fine. Small or large is completely dependent on the beekeeper here. In the center here, we have kind of an interesting house. This is a mason bee observatory house. You'll notice the plastic sides are removable, so you can still harvest your cocoons. But the interesting thing about this is you can pull this out mid-season and just kind of take a look at all of your mason bees as they develop. So you can see the egg and the pollen. You can see the larva eating the pollen. You can see the larva becoming a cocoon. It's pretty neat to watch the process. Mason bee tubes. So the tubes have to be quite the right size for the mason bee. Blue orchard mason bees in particular prefer holes around 8 millimeters. So if you are looking at buying your tubes, it can be a little bit confusing. This is everything we sell here at Chenard's. Take a look at the color. The pink color is going to be your 8 millimeter tube. This is for mason bees specifically. Your blue down here indicates a variety pack. So you're going to have many different sizes, and you're going to encourage many different pollinators to nest here. Your yellow is going to be for leafcutter bees. So you can look for the size on the box, or you can look for the color on the box, but this will just make it a little bit easier to find your tubes. Natural reeds are totally fine, just avoid bamboo. Bamboo is too hard to harvest, and you're going to wind up, as you're picking it apart, probably destroying some of the cocoons. So stick with brittle natural reeds or your paper and cardboard. The important part about having the cardboard and the paper tube, the cardboard is reusable, so you only have to buy this once, and then afterwards you just buy the paper tube. The cardboard tube is going to protect from a specific predator of mason bee called a monowasp. And what the monowasp does is it walks along your mason bee tube and it inserts eggs into each cocoon, which will therefore hatch, eat your mason bee larva, and become a lot of monowasps instead of mason bees. The tube is thick enough that it will prevent most of the eggs from actually reaching your mason bee cocoons. And I just got a photo here of your nesting material. We have just your paper tubes over here on the far right. We have just your cardboard tubes down below. And then we have a pack of starter tubes, which include your cardboard tubes and your paper tubes as well. If you're not into using disposable tubes, you want something that's going to last, but you want to be able to harvest, you don't want to drill holes into wood blocks, your wood nesting trays are amazing here. The nice thing about these is they're actually cut. So each hole is easy to separate. I've got a couple rubber bands on here. So when you're ready to harvest, you remove the rubber bands, separate the blocks, and it's really easy to clean in there. And these will last for years. Harvest and storage supplies. Most of these things you can probably make. Your humidity, you can use a sandwich box with a couple of holes poked into it. The idea here is you are creating a humid space when you are collecting your mason bee cocoons for winter storage. Most refrigerators are not going to be humid enough. You're looking for somewhere around 70% humidity, and you're looking for between 38 and 40 degrees as far as temperature is concerned. On the far left here, we have just a little mesh bag. This is a really fine mesh bag, and that's going to help keep your predators away from your mason bees when they have them in storage, when they're still developing in the garage. So briefly, I'm going to go over harvesting and cleaning your cocoons. Again, we're going to be having another class sometime in October to go over this in further detail. But in October, you're going to take your nesting material that's been in your garage for the last month or so, and you're going to separate your paper tubes to reveal all the mason bee cocoons inside. You're going to inspect those for disease, major parasites. You're probably going to be taking quite a few cocoons out. There's always going to be some parasites in there. It's kind of unavoidable. So you're going to see things like Houdini fly larvae. You're going to see mono wasp predation. You're going to see lots of little black pellets, which the black pellets are fine. That's just mason bee poop. You will clean your cocoons in a mild bleach solution. They are silk cocoons and completely waterproof, so this isn't going to hurt the mason bees. This is just going to get rid of any fungal infections or pollen mites, things on the outsides of your cocoon. 1 tablespoon of bleach in a gallon of water is plenty. Try not to use any more than this. And you only really need to rinse them for 1 to 2 minutes. Just make sure that they get full coverage. And then you rinse the bleach off with just a water solution. You don't want it to be too hot, because if you have the temperatures reach too warm inside the cocoon, they'll hatch, and that's not what we're going for here. So make sure it's kind of a cool temperature. Once they're rinsed, you just pat them with a paper towel, let them air dry for 20 or 30 minutes, and then you pop them in your humidity here or your sandwich container with holes. And again, you store at about 70% humidity, 38 to 40 degrees. And as long as you keep those parameters, you are set to release your cocoons again in mid-March. So common plants for mason bees. There is an incredibly wide variety of flowering plants out there that are going to be early blooming. Some are better than others. Native bees, of course, prefer native flowers. So if you can find native flowers, definitely go there first. Avoid double flowers. The photos I've got right here, the pink flower and the red flower here are both camellias, but one of them is a single flower with the nectaries easily available. The other is a double flower, and this is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for mason bees to get inside and collect nectar and pollen from. So when you're looking at flowers, make sure you get a nice open flower and it's easy to collect. Fruit trees, again, are great. Your pears, your plums, your peaches, anything that's really early to bloom. Native Oregon grape is wonderful. This is Mahonia here in the bottom right corner. It's not quite in flower yet, but we're getting really close. Like I said, camellias, just not double camellias. Snowdrops are wonderful. They're super early. They're easy for the mason bees to get to. Hellebores are great as well, but they are pretty brief in their blooming. So if you want to get a couple different types of hellebore that will bloom at slightly different times, that's a good way to go. Most of your bulbs are going to be early enough and nutritious enough for your mason bees also. So hellebores, daffodils, hyacinth, crocus, things like that are really wonderful pollen and nectar sources for your mason bees. Dandelions, as much as most people hate them, are really nice nutritional sources for mini bees. So it's a good idea to keep a couple dandelions around if you don't mind them terribly much. Heather and sweet box. The nice thing about the sweet box is it will tolerate almost complete shade. So if you have issues with not having enough sun, your sweet box can be a really nice alternative to give your mason bees something too. There are a lot more flowers out there to consider. I will probably have to recommend a couple books here for you. So additional resources, Crown Bees. We get most of our products from Crown Bees, including all of our nesting materials in most of our houses. They are a wealth of knowledge and they are an excellent website to go check out. Oregon State University has an extensive beekeeping lab, so you can check out their extension. They have lots of resources for plants and species of bees and things. The bottom link here, we have a link to the PDF for this booklet, which is really handy if you're interested in all the different types of bees. We have your osmia, your blue orchard and mason bee here. And the cool thing about this booklet is it'll tell you where the pollen is actually carried on each of the bees. So with the blue orchard mason bee, your pollen is going to be carried mainly on the belly. As far as books that you can actually hold in your hands, personally, I love the smell of nice pages. Mason Bee Revolution is a wonderful resource. Both these books on the right side here, Garden Plants for Honeybees and Nectar and Pollen Plants of Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, are excellent resources for finding early flowering plants that are great resources for both honeybees and for your mason bees. Attracting Native Pollinators, also a wonderful resource full of good pictures as well. So those of you who are visually inclined might enjoy this book. All right, I think that's just about all we have for the presentation. If anyone would like to unmute themselves or throw something in chat, I'd love to answer any questions for you. Yes, lavender is a really nice resource. I see all sorts of different native bees on there. You'll see bumblebees, you'll see Apis mellifera, your European honeybee. I've seen mason bees on there as well, and a couple of others. Lavender and rosemary are both really, really awesome resources. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks everyone for joining. If you have any additional questions, I'd love to answer them. Just shoot an email to bees@chenards.com or pop in and ask for Camille. This will be posted later on YouTube as well. So if you'd like a rewatch, if you missed any parts of the class or any of the links, feel free to look it up on YouTube and it should be posted at some point next week. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.